Annie placed her paintbrush down as the telephone called. Nathan was the individual in question. His voice was as cold and detached as the innumerable nights they had shared the same bed in silence. "I will be tardy. Please refrain from waiting." Just like every other occasion, it was brief, uncomplicated, and devoid of any emotion. Annie was frozen, her eyes fixated on the half-finished painting before her, and she was gripping the brush tightly in her hand. The image showed a chamber that was brightly illuminated and was reverberating with laughter. She felt as though the warm tints she had painted were a cruel mockery of her own life. She felt like a neglected extra in someone else's story, waiting for the page to turn in this house that was too large, too pristine, and too silent. She was stunned by the doorbell's ringing. Annie's heart skipped a beat as she blinked. Who could be visiting at this late hour? She proceeded down the hallway, her hand slightly quivering as she reached for the doorknob. Nathan was not present when she opened it, despite her brief, naive optimism that he might present her with flowers or an apology. Elias, Nathan's half-brother, was the individual in question. He stood with a tool-bag casually slung over his shoulder, raindrops adhering to his leather jacket. Elias smiled, a half-smile that was deceptively effortless, yet it had the peculiar ability to temporarily silence Annie. He addressed Annie with a cordial tone of voice. "I trust that I am not causing any inconvenience." "Elias? What are you doing here at this late hour?" she inquired, endeavoring to maintain a composed demeanor, despite the fact that her heart had already begun to beat more rapidly. Elias replied, "Nathan requested that I visit the house to address a few issues." He entered the doorway. His dark eyes possessed a knowing gleam, and his smile persisted. He stated that you would likely not require the assistance. However, I believe that he underestimated the extent of his error. Annie chuckled quietly, but her laughter eluded her before she could suppress it. "Please enter," she said, stepping aside to allow him to enter. She felt it as the door clicked shut behind him. There had been a change. As if Elias had brought a quiet tempest with him, the air in the house became heavier and charged with an unfamiliar tension. The oppressive emptiness that she had grown accustomed to in recent months appeared to disappear for the first time in months, and was replaced by an entity that she was unable to identify. Elias deposited his tool bag by the wall, his gaze sweeping the home with an almost inquisitive intensity. He reflected aloud. "This place is so much like Nathan, perfect, polished but oppressive." Annie emitted a brief, piercing, and unintentional chuckle. "He has a preference for things that are tidy and organized." "And you?" In the gentle glow of the hallway light, Elias's gaze was direct and unwavering as he turned to her. "Do you find it enjoyable to reside in this environment? What is the order?" She was taken aback by the inquiry. Annie hesitated, turning away to evade the pressure of his scrutiny. She pretended to be searching for something in the refrigerator as she made her way to the kitchen, but his words clung to her like shadows. His inquiry was straightforward, yet its implications were dreadful. "Are you content?" Additionally, she harbored an intense dislike for the reality that continued to percolate beneath her silence. She was unaware. She heard his footfall behind her as she struggled with a bottle of water. He was too close. The chill of the home was starkly contrasted with the warmth of his presence, which she could sense. He uttered Annie's name in a voice that was so low and intimate that it caused her to seize her breath. She slowly turned to face him, and for the first time, she observed something in his gaze that she had never noticed before. It was not a form of playfulness or taunting. Rather, it was a raw, unfiltered intensity. And at that instant, Annie forgot about Nathan. She forgot the routines that had drained her of every spark of pleasure, the hollow words and the endless silences. Elias's presence filled the kitchen like a conflagration that had just been ignited, and all she could see and feel was him standing inches away from her. Annie came to the realization that the storm Elias had brought with him was not only causing her home to be unsettled, but also her emotions. Annie experienced a sensation of being in complete darkness, despite the gentle golden light that illuminated the kitchen. Elias's words relentlessly resonated in her consciousness. Is this existence to your liking? She had not responded, not because she was unwilling to do so, but because she was uncertain as to whether she even knew the answer. Her relationship with Nathan was akin to a meticulously framed painting which was flawless and refined, yet ultimately devoid of meaning. Annie's thoughts returned to the initial stages of their union. Nathan was once a man of passion, capable of spending entire evenings in her studio, appreciating her unfinished works. He used to compliment her, kiss her hands that were soiled with paint, and inform her that they were the brushes that painted entire worlds. However, as time progressed, the words of admiration were replaced by work calls, forgotten promises, and, ultimately, lengthy, heart-wrenching silences. Annie was unable to determine the exact moment when it had commenced. However, she eventually began to perceive herself as merely another piece of furniture within her own residence. Nathan was fond of order and the grandeur he could exhibit to his associates. She suspected that, to him, she was merely another item in his collection. He no longer regarded her as the woman he had once idolized. However, his attention was consistently directed toward his contracts, initiatives, and phone. Annie had endeavored to maintain her grip. Not long ago, she organized an intimate dinner by candlelight, donning the dress that Nathan had previously declared his favorite. However, upon his return home, he did not do more than untie his tie, open his laptop, and articulate a single sentence. "Tonight I am excessively fatigued. We should revisit this matter at a later date." She sat alone at the elegantly arranged table that evening, her tears silently falling onto the frigid, unattended food. Everything was distinct with Elias. He gazed at her as if she were a genuine entity, as if she were of significance, from the moment he entered the residence. Elias did not speak frequently. However, each word he spoke had the ability to penetrate her defenses and undermine her fortress. It was as though he could perceive all of the things she attempted to conceal, even from herself. She was occasionally frightened by it. However, there were instances in which she desired that particular truth, regardless of the emotional impact. "Did you enjoy painting as much as you did at one time?" Elias inquired one afternoon as they collaborated to tidy her studio. He raised one of her unfinished pieces and scrutinized the bold but incomplete strokes with an intensity that caused her chest to constrict. Annie did not respond immediately. She stood there, her hands quivering as she recalled the sensation of completely losing herself in her art. She finally acknowledged, her voice quivering, "I used to believe that painting was everything. However, I am uncertain as to whether I am capable of experiencing any sensations at this time." Elias meticulously placed the painting on the ground and approached it. "Therefore, what was the reason for your decision to cease?" he inquired, his gaze fixed on hers, and his inquiry penetrated further than she was at ease with. Annie's irises were obscured by melancholy as she met his gaze. "Nathan does not require it. He requires an ideal wife, not an artist with paint-smeared hands." Her response caused Elias to chuckle gently, albeit with a hint of bitterness. "Therefore you relinquished your identity in order to conform to his desires. Annie, is it worthwhile?" She refrained from responding. However, she was aware that the query was not solely for Elias. It was one that she needed to address for herself. The rain arrived unexpectedly that evening, splattering down like silent weeping and tapping against the glass panes. Annie stood by the window, her arms crossed securely over her chest, her gaze adrift in the hazy veil of falling rain. The home felt colder and more void with each passing hour as Nathan had been absent for 2 days. However, tonight was distinct. Elias was present, and his presence imbued the area with an unfamiliar energy that she was unable to identify. Elias was engaged in a task in the kitchen. The suffocating silence that Annie had grown accustomed to was interrupted by the gentle clinking of objects and faint movements that reverberated throughout the house. Annie was uncertain as to what he was doing. He reappeared in the living room's doorway a moment later, clutching 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. He stated that you require this. He had a mischievous twinkle in his gaze. Annie smiled as she retrieved the steaming mug from his grasp. She spoke softly, "You always have the ability to elevate the atmosphere." Elias sat in close proximity to her, but it was unnecessary. The air between them appeared to be filled with the warmth of his body. "Do you consistently exhibit this level of anxiety?" he inquired, his demeanor a blend of sincere curiosity and playful taunting. She let out a gentle chuckle, the sound escaping her lips before she could suppress it. "I do not believe that I am apprehensive. It is possible that I have forgotten how to unwind." Elias responded by angling his head as he observed her. "Relaxing is not difficult. The only requirement is a desire to attempt." Annie opened her mouth to respond, but a thunderclap shook the windows, and a burst of lightning illuminated the room. The glass was hammered by the rain, which appeared to be on the verge of shattering. Elias stood and raised an eyebrow. "Have you ever taken a walk in the rain?" he inquired, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. "Are you being sincere?" "It is currently raining heavily outside." Annie shook her head, but Elias grabbed her hand and lifted her to her feet before she could continue to speak. "Annie, there are certain activities in life that must be completed only once. Come on." He was leading her out the front door before she could protest, and they both ran directly into the icy deluge. Annie's laughter was genuine, as it blended seamlessly with the rhythmic patter of the rain. It was a peculiar and liberating sensation, as if the tempest had removed the invisible chains she had been carrying for years. Elias escorted her to the backyard, where the porch light's faint radiance illuminated the slick stone steps. Annie was indifferent to the fact that they were standing there, soaked to the bone. She experienced a sense of vitality for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. There was no disguise to wear, and no restraint was in place. There was only her, the rain, and the unbridled sense of liberation that accompanied it. Elias approached her, his dark eyes alighting on her with a fervor that caused her chest to constrict. "Do you have an understanding of your appearance when you are laughing?" His voice was subdued and almost reverent as he inquired. Annie's joy gradually dissipated as she froze. "What is the matter?" she murmured, her voice slightly trembling. Similar to an individual who has recently rediscovered her identity, she could now feel his breath mingling with the cool rain as he took another step forward, so close. "Have you ever contemplated this? Would you experience greater happiness if you adopted a different lifestyle, if you permitted yourself to do so?" The inquiry persisted in the air, piercing through the rain and settling deeply into her heart. Annie opened her mouth to respond, but she was unable to summon any words. Elias then slowly raised his hand and gently touched her cheek with his fingertips, as if everything had been building up to this moment. His contact was hesitant, as if he were anticipating her withdrawal. However, she refrained from doing so. Annie felt every ounce of logic and control she had worked so hard to hold on to slide away in that fleeting second, as their eyes met. Elias' lips scarcely touched hers as he leaned in, offering a faint kiss. However, that gentle, tentative contact was sufficient to induce a sensation of warmth within her, thereby dispelling the chill of the storm. Annie closed her eyes, allowing herself to be consumed by the moment and by him, as the rain washed away all of the fears and inhibitions she had previously held on to. Upon their separation, Annie's heartbeat was so intense that it resonated in her ears, and her breath was interrupted by irregular intakes. Elias's eyes were filled with both longing and uncertainty as he gazed at her, as if he too comprehended the magnitude of the event that had just occurred. He murmured, his voice hoarse and raw, "If you want me to stop, I will." However, Annie declined to respond. She stood there, allowing the rain to seep through her clothing and into her skin. The emotions she had been striving so frantically to suppress rose to the surface, unmistakable and unyielding. The morning light delicately filtered through the curtains, casting pale rays across Annie's face. However, it did little to alleviate the chaos that was raging in her mind. She sat straight in bed, closely grasping the blanket as if it were the sole barrier preventing her from falling into the emptiness she perceived as threatening to consume her. The memory of last night remained on her lips like a searing mark. The kiss with Elias was not merely a brief moment of vulnerability, it was a revelation, a rekindling of a flame that had been suppressed within her for years. However, the weight of it all bore down on her with a crushing force in the stark clarity of daylight. It was not merely an impulsive error that occurred last night. It was the crossing of a boundary, the obliteration of a line. Elias had departed early that morning, but he had not forgotten to leave a note on the kitchen counter. The words were succinct, yet they were substantial. Last night was genuine. I will remain in place until you arrive. Her chest was strained by the note, which felt like 1,000 pounds. Annie was aware that she was required to make a decision. However, she had not anticipated that it would occur so soon. She was still ensnared in the labyrinth of her own thoughts when the sound of the front door opening jolted her upright at noon. Nathan was at home. He entered with his customary sense of fatigue. However, this time, there was something distinctive about him. His gaze, which was both sharp and penetrating, remained on her for an excessive amount of time. Annie endeavored to maintain her composure. However, his presence abruptly felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on her. "Are you in good health?" Nathan inquired, his voice subdued and tinged with suspicion. Annie responded promptly, her eyes unable to meet his. "I am fine," she said. The atmosphere was dense with unspoken tension as Annie, Nathan, and Elias all sat down for dinner that evening. Elias endeavored to preserve a casual demeanor. However, his glimpses at Annie were swift and incriminating. Nathan appeared to perceive the undercurrent in the room, despite his silence. The air between them was taut, akin to a wire that had been stretched too far and was on the brink of breaking. And it did. Nathan abruptly dropped his knife, his gaze piercing as he turned to Elias. "Have you been residing here for an extended period of time?" he stated with a voice that was both calm and sharp. "There is a sense that you are becoming overly at ease in this residence." Elias smirked, his mandible tightening in anticipation of a response. However, Annie intervened before the situation could worsen. Nathan refrained from causing a disturbance. Elias was requested to remain and assist with a few household tasks. He has not been a nuisance at all. Nathan's irises, which were as sharp as a blade, darted toward her. "Is that accurate, Annie? Alternatively, is there a detail that I am not being informed about?" The fragile silence in the room was shattered by his words, which struck like a hammer. Annie's thorax contracted, and she briefly experienced difficulty breathing. She suddenly realized the vulnerability of her situation. A single erroneous action or poorly selected word would result in the complete collapse of the situation. "Nathan, what are you discussing?" she inquired, her voice trembling at the margins as she endeavored to maintain its stability. Nathan did not respond immediately. He simply gazed at her, his expression betraying a mixture of suspicion and an additional quality that she was unable to identify. The weight of his presence was left behind like an open wound, as he stood and left the room without another word after a long, agonizing pause. The silence that ensued was deafening. Elias remained seated, his hands grasping the edge of the table as if to anchor himself. Eventually he broke the silence. "Are you planning to inform him?" he inquired with a voice that was both steady and gruff, and was tinged with urgency. Annie turned to him, her eyes gleaming in red. "Elias, what should I say? That I deceived him? That I permitted myself to experience an emotion that was not appropriate for me?" Elias interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "It is not about what you should not feel. It pertains to the emotions that you are entitled to experience. It is a matter of having the courage to pursue the existence you desire." She was affected by his words like a blow, unrelenting and raw. Annie did not respond. She stood from the table and exited the room, leaving Elias behind. His gaze followed her retreating figure until she vanished into the hallway shadows. Annie wept silently as she reclined in bed that evening, soaking the pillow beneath her. She found herself at a fork in the road, and she would be unable to reverse her decision, regardless of which path she chose. A marriage that was steeped in responsibility but devoid of affection was present on one side. Conversely, a fervent, unpredictable bond with Elias. However, Annie was acutely aware that either option would necessitate sacrifices that she was uncertain she was prepared to make. Annie was unable to fall asleep. Her mind was a labyrinth of tangled thoughts with no clear way out. As the night extended on in the darkness and endlessness, the wind whistled through the gaps in the windows, a ghostly reminder that time was slipping by, indifferent to her turmoil from the outside. She could hear every frantic beat of her heart, wild and erratic, as though it were attempting to wrench itself free from her chest in the oppressive silence of the night. Annie rose from the bed, unable to endure the bedroom's oppressive weight any longer. Upon entering the hallway, she was enveloped by darkness. The house's tranquility was no longer reassuring, but rather ominous and hollow. She felt as though she was edging closer to a decision she was unsure she was prepared to make with each step across the chilly wooden floor. The hallway was illuminated by a feeble glow emanating from the table lamp, and the door to the living room was left ajar. Elias sat in a hunched position, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes adrift in contemplation. Although he did not raise his head upon her arrival, her mere presence was sufficient to alter the atmosphere of the room. Annie hesitated by the door, uncertain about how to commence. In the end, it was Elias who broke the stillness. "Have you made a decision yet?" he inquired tenderly, his voice steady but tinged with a subtle tremor. Annie did not respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the lamp's flickering light as she approached, its unsteady radiance reflecting the confusion in her mind. "Elias, I am uncertain," she finally replied, her voice scarcely rising above a whisper. "Everything is so overwhelming. I am uncertain about my capacity to undergo a transformation." Elias rose from his seat and approached the speaker. He extended his hand, lightly brushing it against Annie's. The contact was so fleeting that Annie was unable to discern whether it was intended to solace her or to implore her. He declared, "I will be present," his voice unwavering and his eyes brimming with a sincerity that penetrated her defenses. "Regardless of your decision. However, Annie, you must begin to live for yourself, rather than for others." His words were akin to a blade that sliced through her meticulously crafted facade. Existing for oneself. Who was she? A free spirit, an impassioned artist, or merely a shadow in Nathan's world? The hallway reverberated with the sound of footfall before she could respond. Annie was frozen as Nathan entered the room, his face a facade that was impossible to read, and his eyes were ablaze with suspicion. He stood there observing the scene, the tension in the air, the proximity between them, before his gaze finally fell on her. "Annie," he said, his voice subdued and deliberate. "What is the situation?" Time seemed to have halted. Annie's heart seized in her bosom. Elias maintained his composure, refusing to divert his gaze from Nathan's penetrating gaze. In that instant, Annie was aware that the fragile equilibrium she had been clinging to had been disrupted. No longer were there any opportunities for concealment or escape. She began, her voice quivering but firm with determination, "Nathan, it is imperative that we engage in conversation." However, Nathan raised his hand to silence her before she could say another word. His tone was as frigid as frost, and he replied, "There is nothing to discuss. I have observed an amount that is sufficient." His words were final and unyielding, resonating throughout the room. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, his footfall reverberating down the hallway before disappearing into the shadows. Annie refrained from adhering to him. She did not exhort him to cease. She stood as tears welled up in her eyes, causing her vision to distort. Elias advanced, but she this time managed to prevent him by raising her hand. She replied, "No, Elias," her voice faltering. "I require solitude." His expression was characterized by a calm anguish as he gazed at her for an extended period. He finally nodded, his eyes heavy with unspoken anguish. "All right," he said quietly. "However, you are aware of my location in the event that you require my assistance." Elias exited the room, his footfall gradually diminishing into silence. Annie was frozen in the center of the room, enveloped by the frigid emptiness of the home. She gradually settled into a chair, concealing her face in her hands. She came to the realization that there was no turning back, regardless of the path she chose at that moment. She had crossed a threshold, and nothing would ever be the same again. Annie awoke the following morning to a residence that was enveloped in silence. Nathan was absent. Elias was absent. The only thing in the room was her and the pallid sunlight that streamed through the windows. For the first time in years, she sat down at her work table and picked up a brush. She was not painting to satisfy anyone this time. She was not painting as a means of evading, painting for her own benefit. She painted an avian that was breaking free from an open cage on the canvas, its wings extending toward an uncertain but boundless sky. Annie did not experience any anxiety, despite the fact that the painting was incomplete. She comprehended for the first time that certain narratives did not necessitate a neat conclusion. Like what you heard. There's plenty more heartbreak and secrets to come. Hit like, subscribe, and stay curious with Tangled Truths.